In today's video, we get historical with a look at the history and accuracy of the tanks seen in Battlefield 1. This is the first in a new series of videos where I want to look at the historical aspects of the Battlefield franchise and try to provide some good old-fashioned edutainment. Now, I'm by no means a historian, but I'm doing these videos to learn for myself as well, as I really enjoy studying this. Alright, throw on your tanker gear, squeeze into a 20-ton steel death machine, and get ready to dive into the world of World War I era tanks. As the Great War was the first major conflict to see the use of tanks, before I jump into talking about the actual ones seen in-game, I did want to talk about some of the history of tanks themselves. The idea of a mobile armored platform to protect soldiers in battle goes back centuries. Protected siege towers, battering rams, and armored war animals could be considered the first tanks of the battlefield. Leonardo da Vinci famously sketched a mobile armored gun platform in the 15th century, so tanks were not really a novel concept before World War I. And it makes sense, as a soldier you want to keep as many things as possible between you and the pointy bits of your enemy's weapons. However, by the early 20th century, the leaps in technology and manufacturing opened up a whole new ballgame here. Inventions such as the combustible engine and machine gun led to the first modern armored fighting vehicles as early as 1898. And armored cars such as the Char and Rolls-Royce became commonly used throughout World War I as scouting vehicles, which also appear in Battlefield 1. As the war grew more intense, trenches, barbed wire, craters, mud, and rain made crossing the terrain on the Western Front an increasingly difficult task. The need for the ability to cross while protected grew rapidly as both sides fought to break the stalemate. The armored cars had a significant disadvantage in that they needed smooth terrain in order to function, and were fairly useless here. With no small amount of ingenuity, the modern-day tank began to take form. Under great secrecy, the British began development of armored fighting vehicles that use caterpillar tracks, as seen on farming machines such as tractors. They codenamed these as water tanks, and the name tank stuck, although the term landship was used commonly as well. While they could cross the terrain as expected, these early tanks were plagued with lots of mechanical issues, and even finding crew able to drive them at first was difficult, as only the wealthy had any experience with motorized vehicles at the time. Despite these issues, on September 15, 1916, 36 tanks were deployed at the Battle of Somme, and the race for armored superiority began. With that very simplified review of tank history out of the way, let's take a look at the actual tanks that appear in Battlefield 1. Starting with the light tank, we have the Renault FT17. The Renault would come to be one of the most influential tank designs of World War I. This was a French-designed two-passenger tank that featured a configuration that is still used to this day as a standard tank layout. The configuration being a crew compartment at the front, engine in the back, and primary armament in a rotating turret on top. In fact, this was the first production tank to use a fully rotating turret. The turret was originally designed to house a Hotchkiss 8mm machine gun, however in 1918 versions of the turret that housed the Puteaux 37mm cannon were developed as well. Although much lighter than its counterparts, the FT-17 still weighed almost 7 tons. Looking at pictures, the team at DICE did an amazing job of recreating this tank in-game, and it looks really accurate. The model features a long tail that assisted the tank in crossing trenches, and lots of little cool details like chains and shovels are seen mounted on the tank as well. However, mostly due to the needs of gameplay, the Renault in-game is most likely very different from how the tank functioned in real life. The biggest changes to me seem to be the speed and crew size. In-game, the FT-17 only carries one player, who is able to drive and fire at the same time, while in real life, the tank required 2 crew members to do this. The tank in-game also appears to go around 25 to 30 miles per hour, whereas in real life, the top speed of the Renault was only 4.5 miles per hour, so not exactly fast and the furious out there. Other things like reloading speed and unlimited ammunition are of course gameplay concessions that are present with all vehicles in-game. With all of that though, this is still an incredibly cool vehicle to see, and to see the many influences this early design inspired for modern vehicle warfare. Next, let's look at the heavy tank, or A7V. The A7V Sturmpanzerwagen, or armored assault vehicle, was the only German-designed tank that saw combat in World War I. With the appearance of British armor at the Battle of Somme, the German War Ministry formed a committee to tackle tank development. By September 1917, 1 year after the first appearance of British tanks, German engineers completed the first pre-production version of the A7V. The A7V was much larger and heavier than the tank we just looked at. Weighing over 30 tons and manned by a crew of up to 25 members, this thing was a beast. The A7V featured a 57mm cannon as its main armament and 6 7.9mm MG08 machine guns. Despite, or maybe because of its size, armor, and armaments, only 20 A7Vs were ever produced, and many broke down before they even saw action. As a result, the Germans did not really consider this tank to be a success, and had several prototypes planned to go into production, but the war ended before any more came into action. In-game, the A7V is classified as the heavy tank, and is pretty different from its real-life counterpart. In real life, this tank required a minimum crew of 18, however in-game can only fit 6 players total with the standard variant. The boxy design clearly shows this tank's status as one of the earliest versions of the armored war machine, however it does carry an intimidation factor. In an era where cars were still a novelty, seeing a tank crawling across the muddy ground towards you, spewing black smoke and seemingly impervious to bullets, you begin to see the psychological effectiveness of these machines. Again, it's just really cool to see this bit of history come to life in a Battlefield game. The Mark V landship is up next. I would say this is the most iconic tank design for me in representing World War I, and was featured heavily in Battlefield 1's marketing to really show how different this conflict was from other settings seen in video games. The British Mark V, as the name suggests, is an upgrade from the Mark IV, and was used in multiple battles near the end of the war, including the Battle of Amiens, which also appears in Battlefield 1 as an excellent map, by the way. Originally, the Mark V was to be a completely new tank design, however, to avoid disruptions in current production, it was adapted to fit the latest Mark IV engine and transmissions. Despite these advancements, the tank suffered from other issues, such as carbon monoxide poisoning for the crew, as if other problems with being in a tank in World War I weren't enough. As British tanks began crossing the terrain, German forces began widening the trenches to up to 11 or even 12 feet wide. As a result, variants of the Mark V were developed with longer bodies and tracks to adapt to these wider trenches. Just a small example of the rapid developments and counter-developments of World War I. The Mark V weighed 29 tons and carried a crew of up to 8. In-game, the tank only carries 5 soldiers and features several variants, including one equipped with what seems to be a Mauser anti-tank rifle. While there are variants of the Mark V in real life, I couldn't really find an example of this being historically accurate. Lots of attention to detail here that makes this one stand out to me. I especially like how mud gets pulled up and clogs the tracks. Just a really interesting war machine. Next, let's look at the Sanchemand assault tank, which was added in the They Shall Not Pass or French Forces DLC. The Sanchemand was the second French tank used during the war, and over 400 were built. A tank of very interesting design, the most notable features of the Sanchemand are its shorter track length and large overhanging front compartment that housed the primary armament. In real life, these features were actually large issues that reduced the effectiveness of the tank in combat. The tracks were just too short for the length and weight of the tank itself, and proved ineffective at crossing trenches as easily as other tanks. Near the end of the war, the Sanchemand actually became more effective, as fighting moved out of the trenches and back onto open ground. Despite its weight, the tank could actually reach a top speed of 7.5 miles per hour. However, it rarely was able to go up to this top speed without the front end digging into the ground. Letters and reports from the front confirm the ineffectiveness of this tank in many ways. However, in addition to the huge front-facing 75mm cannon, the Sanchemand features 4 additional Hotchkiss machine guns, one in front, one on each side, and one in the rear. In-game, these are accurately represented, at least with the field assault variant. Overall, an incredibly unique design for a vehicle, and it is so interesting to just learn how experimental many of these tanks were when they hit the front lines. Lastly, we have the mother of all tanks, the massive Char 2C. Also added as part of the French DLC, the Char 2C was, at least in physical dimensions, the largest operational tank ever built. A super heavy tank, the Char 2C in-game is given special treatment as a behemoth, and it makes sense. This thing was enormous. At over 33 feet long and 9 feet wide, the Char weighed around 70 tons. To put that into perspective, that is about 5 school buses worth of weight. Some adult blue whales weigh 75 tons, only 5 tons more than this tank. The Char required a crew of 12 to man and featured a 75mm cannon mounted in the turret, as well as 4 8mm Hotchkiss machine guns at the front, sides, and rear. The development of the Char 2C is very interesting. In 1916, and I'm going to butcher his name, General Leon Augustin Jean-Marie Muret commissioned the construction of a super heavy tank from a shipyard of all places. The design was to build a tank that had better internal layout, ergonomics, and ventilation, and he felt shipbuilders could improve upon existing French tank designs. However, with the lack of public or even political scrutiny of tank projects, that until this point were largely kept secret, little to no work was actually done until months later, as tanks began to gain more public attention. There was no small amount of internal struggling within the French military, as proponents of the lighter Renault FT tanks worried that construction of heavy tanks would reduce their own resources and vice versa. Eventually, the French army favored a higher number of light tanks as opposed to a lower number of heavy tanks, and the Char 2C did not actually see the light of day during the war. Although it was built after the war, it was used more as a propaganda piece instead of an actual war machine. And by the 1930s, advancements in anti-tank cannons made the Char 2C's designs pretty obsolete. However, that did not stop the teams at DICE from putting one in the game, and it delivers. Classified as a behemoth, the huge size seems accurate, although again the only crew it can hold man the 5 armaments, as opposed to the 12 needed to operate the tank in real life. In-game, the Char is extremely tough, and this corresponds to it having some of the thickest armor of the World War I era tanks. Overall, another incredibly cool piece of history that we get to enjoy within an awesome game. I really hope you enjoyed the video and learning a little bit more about the history behind the game. I did skip vehicles such as the artillery and assault trucks, and maybe I can address those at another time. But if you enjoyed this content, leave a like and subscribe as it helps a lot, and I'll be happy to continue this historical series going forward. Until next time.